So, hi everyone, and welcome to this webinar on irrigation systems. We've got three people with a lot of experience of different irrigation systems that they have created, loved, and probably in some cases despised, and they're going to talk about. We've got Dan from Glebelands Organics in Manchester. We've got Iain Tolhurst from Tolhurst Organics in Oxfordshire, and we've got Pete Dollimore, who is ex Hankham Organics and currently working at the Montessori place in East Sussex. So we're going to have presentations from the three of them, and then there'll be a section for questions at the end. And I'm going to hand over to Iain, who is going to start. Thanks, Iain.
This will be the best piece of kit you ever buy. It's going to cost you about £3.50. It's a rain gauge. You cannot run a farm or any sort of ground unless you have a rain gauge. So we've got a couple of these dotted around. They're really useful for checking the rainfall, obviously, but also really useful for checking how much irrigation you're putting on, because often it's quite hit and miss. If you're applying irrigation, you really want to make sure you're putting the right amount on. So a rain gauge, we have one outside our packing shed. We have a chart. We record it every day. We've got very uninterestingly to most people, we have 35 years of records, which actually make fascinating reading, and it's a great party subject for me. I am the ultimate weather bore, I think. I can quote you all sorts of ridiculous statistics about the weather, particularly rainfall over the last 35 years. So rain gauge, really important. The real basics, I mean, this is, I'm going to go through our system, starting with our rather smaller areas of garden, greenhouses, tunnels and propagation, moving up to field. The watering can, we still use a watering can, and we use it mostly in our propagation area. And we tend to use rainwater primarily because it's soft, it's much nicer, it tends to be warmer than tap water. The worst thing you can do to young seedlings in a greenhouse is to soak them with freezing cold tap water. So we tend to allow the water to warm up a bit. So the black bin, it works really well. It's water off the roof. It's our one of our only collection points. And you'll see on top of that rather untidy looking collection of water is a hose with a lance on the end. Well, we haven't got a lance, we've actually just got the rose at the moment, but normally there's a lance on there. And this we also use for watering in our propagation area. But the watering can is still one of the best tools, particularly for very early plants before they get too big. So here we are, here's the lance being used, watering outdoor waiting bed. The thing about a lance is it's quite accurate. You can put on exactly the amount of water you need, whereas an overhead system, unless it's really very high tech, will not get to all the corners. And the real important thing about when you're watering trays is, and it's something my old mum's window cleaner used to say, if you look after the corners and the edges, the middle looks after itself. And that's really true. So when you're watering, you need to water the edges and then the middle last. And that's an efficient way of watering trays. This is our propagation house. So in the propagation house, all this is done with the lance. Like I say, when they're very small, we use the watering can with warmed up water. If it's really cold, we actually leave buckets of water in the greenhouse overnight to warm up on the heated benches. Things like peppers, cucumbers, courgettes, things that get bigger, then yes, we soak them with the lance. And here we have an overhead misting system, which we use primarily for mist propagation of strawberry plants, but it's also quite handy for watering seedlings. It comes on, it's on a magic leaf. It comes on and off depending on the humidity. It's really useful. It's quite an expensive thing to have for irrigation, but because we bought it specifically for strawberry plants, we do use it. And it covers a bed. These beds, each of these beds in this 100-year-old greenhouse, each of these beds are 6-7 meters long and 1.3 meters wide, and it covers that really well. It waters it beautifully. Very fine mist. There's no drips, so it's a very good thing for watering very young plants. We have all our trays on a sand bed. The sand helps to maintain the moisture content as well. Moving on to slightly larger mostly tunnel irrigation, we have leaky pipe. We've tried all sorts of different types of leaky pipe. I think most growers have tried every type of leaky pipe. We've pretty much given up on leaky pipes for various reasons. They're really not all they're cracked up to be. I mean, the idea really was to try and save water. It hasn't actually done an awful lot about saving water. The amount we've saved is pretty negligible. the effort in setting these up and what they call the FAF factor with lots of plastic fittings and bits to go wrong and Jubilee clips and all manner of things. It's just a big hassle. It really is. And the other problem we have is we have very hard water. So we get a lot of calcification in the pipes. So they only really last about 3 or 4 years, and then we have to replace them. It's quite an expensive operation. So we still do a little bit of trickle irrigation with pipes, but we don't do very much. The other problem we have is we have a lot of very sharp flints, which do a lot of damage. So for us, this type of irrigation, drip line irrigation, soaker hose, netter film, these type of things, hasn't really worked that well. It's not to say it wouldn't work on your site, but it hasn't really worked too well on our site. Also, we're on quite a steep slope in the wall garden. The irrigation shed, we have a shed dedicated to irrigation. Irrigation takes up an enormous amount of time. It really does. I mean, anything you can do to make this job easier and more efficient pays off. So we have a whole range of fittings there. All those boxes have got different fittings in. We've got lots of spares. Anybody that's run irrigation systems will know that you're forever running around with bits and bobs of different fittings and spanners and tape and all the rest of it. There's a little toolbox there, toolbox dedicated just to irrigation only and nothing else. It's supposed to live in the irrigation shed, so it's always available. The thing about irrigation, you will often get an emergency which needs to be dealt with quickly. If it's not dealt with quickly, you could be wasting lots of water or you could be flooding a tunnel. So having a kit on hand is really useful. You'll see there in the bins next to the bench is a whole lot of standpipes. These are our main garden sprinkler system. We have 3 sets of those. Each set contains 6 of those uprights. We can run 6 of those at one time. We're actually really sport for pressure. We have a garden system pressured to 10.5 bar, which is unbelievable. So we can run a huge amount of sprinklers at any one time. It's all through a 34mm pipe, so we've got a really good watering system. And we have 3 sets of those sprinklers. They're joined by flexible pipes. Each one is 7 meters long, and we space them roughly across the plot about 7 to 8 meters apart, and that gives us a really good coverage. We run them for around 40 to 60 minutes. That usually does about 20 to 25 millimeters of water. One of our propagation heights, this is a fairly new one I built a few years ago. We've installed an overhead very fine mister spray for watering seedlings. This works pretty well, but you still need to do a little bit of top up around the edges with a watering can occasionally, because it doesn't quite water the edges that well because it relies on a system of overlapping. If you had lots of these in different rows across the whole building, you would get a better cover. But one row on its own is okay, but it doesn't work that great. All our piping, our overhead piping is PVC, 32mm. This stuff seems to last forever. Some of the piping I have moved from my first farm in Cornwall, and I know it's from the late 70s. It's still in use. It's over 45 years old. It's still in use. It's unbelievably indestructible, this stuff. So it's got a huge lifespan. In that same greenhouse, this one here, we have this overhead system which I made up. I looked at buying a proprietary setup for this. It was incredibly expensive. I managed to do the same thing with a bit of galvanized wire, some little pulleys, some overall bits and pieces, and some old Trick-Reflex hose to support the hose. And this works really well. So we can pull this thing along the greenhouse without damaging all your plants. One of the worst things that I've seen people doing is dragging hoses across their plants. It does so much damage. And this keeps the hose off the ground. It stops it getting damage from flints, and it just keeps the whole thing nice and orderly. Here we have that Mr. Drip system in operation. It's not automatic. It has to be turned on manually. It could be automatic, but we choose to do it manually. It's a really fine spray. It works really, really well. In our other greenhouses, all our systems are overhead, and in most of this is our only large greenhouse. Most of them are 3 triple lines to a greenhouse. Our greenhouses are 30 meters long and 8 to 9 meters wide. 3 does really well. 2 will just about fit, but with 2, you don't quite get good watering down the middle, or you don't get it on the edges. And it's really important to make sure that any overhead system you put up is getting the edges really well. Many of them often not set up properly. You don't get watering right up to the edge. If you haven't got it in the right position relative to the side of the tunnel, it will hit the tunnel walls and it won't actually water the last metre or so. So you need to really check on that. There's nothing quite like going in and having a prod around with a trowel to see what you've actually done when you water, because it's all very well looking at it and thinking, well, that's wet. It may not be. And this is where we use the rain gauge. The rain gauge has been invaluable, not just for me initially, but also for our staff to learn how much to water and to, to watch out for problem areas. So the rain gauge gets moved around different places. It's in continuous use. When we have trainees, they get to learn how to use it as well. We rate that rain gauge as being really important. You often find dry areas, and that's usually one overhead sprinkler blocked to make a big difference. We've used this a lot in the wall garden. It works great on the flat land, but most of our wall garden is quite steep. It's a small hose reel. It does 50 meters long. I built a small mobile irrigator with pin jet nozzles doing an 8-meter wide piece. It's very efficient. It does quite a good job. It's quite slow. It was taking about 6 or 7 hours to do a run to put enough water on, but it's the sort of thing you can just leave and forget about. So it's certainly quite useful on level flat land. It could be really useful. You need some form of guidance. We were using open half-round drainage pipes in order to keep it tracking, because the three-wheel trolley would tend to career off somewhere on its own. It hit a stone or something, it'd go off on a tangent and destroy your crops. That's the other thing about mobile sprinklers. They will, in time, occasionally do terrible damage. And don't ever try and run one over the top of a fleece cover. Don't ask me how I found out about that one. Right, in the garden, we're using this system. So we've got 6 of these all coupled together. Works really well. It's very efficient. It's quite easy. It uses a lot of water. It needs pressure. But as I say, we've got really good pressure to work that. They're pretty cheap. I mean, I made these up myself, made the stands. I've had the stands for over 40 years, so they've stood the test of time. They're not galvanized, they're just bits of steel cobbled together with, I'm not a very good welder, but I managed to make them stick. And it's really, really very useful. It's easy to move around. We have a dedicated wheelbarrow. It all goes onto a wheelbarrow and you move it to the next plot. We have 3 of these systems, and we can leave one in place, usually on a seed bed where we're growing peg plants and seed bed outdoors. We'll leave it in place because generally we tend to try and water them daily to keep the flea beetle away. If we keep the ground wet, the flea beetle are really not a problem. So yeah, really useful system. You can do quite large areas. I did many years ago in my stupid youth. I did manage to do 3 acres with this setup, but it meant working sort of 24 hours a day, getting up at every 3 hours at night and moving it. And it's not something you want to be doing when you get to my age. But yes, if you really pushed, you might well do that. Incidentally, I was just thinking about how I got started in this. And my startup in horticulture really was in 1976. And there's probably almost nobody on here old enough to remember 1976, but it was the longest and most persistent drought we'd ever had in this country. And that was my first ever year in commercial growth. So I learned very quickly about irrigation. And what I learned about irrigation was you had to have a really good system, because if you didn't, you would spend all your time just managing water supply. And the other thing I was thinking about today was this time last year, we were irrigating in the field. So far this year, we've almost got nothing in the field. It's so wet. So, no 2 years are the same. It varies so much from year to year. Right, moving on to the field irrigation. This is probably the most simple of all. It covers the biggest possible area. We're doing, well, in total, our field crops, our 2 fields come to just over 17 acres, although 4 acres of that is in green manure crops at any one time, and we tend not to water those. We don't water long-term green manures. We allow the soil to crack. I think it's really important to let drought do its stuff, particularly on long-term green manures. We have a borehole which I installed when I first got here. It was pretty much the first job. Having come from Cornwall, even in Cornwall, we had done some irrigation, although it's much wetter. I knew that South Oxfordshire was dry. Our annual rainfall is is around 550 millimeters. It can vary enormously. We've had as low as 350 millimeters in a year, which is incredibly dry, and as high as over a meter. So it's incredibly variable. If there's one thing you can predict about the weather, it's the complete unpredictability of it. So the borehole was essential. I got a local water company who knew the area. There's not a lot of boreholes in our area. There's nobody stupid enough to be growing vegetable crops on soil of this quality. So we didn't have much competition, but they knew the geology quite well. They knew where to go. They quoted me for I think it was a 40-foot borehole, which is about 13 or 14 meters. They hit water at 2 meters because we're literally on the water table. The water table is pretty much the level of the Thames most of the year. So loads of water. They had to go really deeper than that in order to get into the chalk to get good good supply of water so it would replenish quickly. So I went down to 13 meters. That cost me, this is 35 years ago, it cost me $2,500, which was an enormous amount of money for me in those days. I mean, today's equivalent would be about $7 or $8,000. It hasn't gone up that much, really, considering the passage of time. We have a really good supply of water. I mean, we could not exhaust this supply. The pump there doesn't look much, but that pump is capable of shifting 50 tons of water an hour. We never do use that amount. We're on about half that. We're shifting about 25 ton an hour, but it is an incredible bit of pump. I've had that since I've been at Harvard. I've had it 35 years. It's only ever broken once, and of course it broke right in the middle of a long drought, as they always do. And the Italian parts were inaccessible because Italians have a month of holiday in the summer. So that's something to look out for. If you're relying on a pump, and you do get to rely on the pump, you need to make sure that you've got a backup somewhere you can get in case you need it. So this is sited literally next door to the borehole. There's the green flexible pipe goes into the borehole. There's a strainer on there. And then the top pipe goes into a 75 millimeter PVC, which is buried all the way around the field. We have a whole grid system across the two fields. It's like a letter H. It's over 1,000 meters in total of piping. We even gone under the public road, which was quite an expensive experience going under the public road. So we've got around 1,000 meters of piping. We run this at pressure. The pressure at the pump here will run at about 9 bar. By the time it gets to the irrigator, it's down to about 3.5 to 4 bar. So we lose quite a bit of pressure. We are shifting uphill. We're going in total, it's almost 20 meters head. So we are shifting a lot of water up quite a gradient. Great bit of kit. I mean, the tractor, I don't normally put this tractor on there. I just stuck it on there today to show, but I have a really ancient Zeta tractor, which has a 2-speed PTO. So we run it on 1,000 RPM. It uses less than 2 liters of diesel an hour, which is incredibly frugal. And it just ticks over. We generally run this, when we're usually going from about 6 in the morning to about 10 at night, usually around 4 or 5 days a week. We try to get it all. We can get around the whole farm. We can get around the whole lot literally in 5 days if we run quite long days. Then we can get a few days off. Irrigation's a chore. It really is. Once this is set up, it's pretty easy. It doesn't take much effort, but you still have to be around. So piping, we have these hydrants all the way along the field. Every 40 meters, we have one of these. It's a 3-inch pipe with a hydrant on the top. They're presently closed with a plastic bag, but the tap is left open. If you leave these taps closed in the winter, they freeze and they pop. And they're 30, 40 quid each, and we've got 12 of them, so we don't want that to happen. So we leave them open. The plastic bag keeps the mice out. Believe it or not, I don't know how they do it, but somehow mice can move in there over winter, and then they start nesting. So everything is sealed off in the autumn. Well, in the early winter, we seal everything. We drain everything down. We seal everything. Even the sprinklers on the spray boom, we have to tape over because bees move in. We have such a lot of biodiversity around. It just wants to move into our irrigation system. So everything's sealed over. If you don't do this, when you drag out the nettles in the spring, everything's full of crap, basically, and you spend 2 or 3 days cleaning it all out. So again, it's really about putting things away properly, and it really does pay. In the first few years, I would spend days getting the irrigation set up. Now it's ready to go instantly, and that's really about looking after things properly. So here we have the irrigator. This is the spray boom. This is 20 meters wide. I've actually extended it. It was originally 16. I've made it wider. It's very easy to make these things bigger. Put some extra rigging on. This gets taken up to the other end of the field by the tractor. The tractor pulls it along. And you'll see there, this was taken last year. This would have been, well, the potatoes are just touching across the row. So this is about the third week in June. We always reckon that if your potatoes are touching across the row by the third week in June, you're going to get a good crop. And we did get a pretty good crop. So this would be the early ones, third week in June. By this time, they'd already been irrigated probably once. So the boom gets dragged up to the top of the field with a tractor. It's always quite a hairy moment driving through a crop like this with a fairly large, well, it's not large, it's smallest tractor, but it does do some damage, but it does recover pretty quickly. The spray boom's left at the top of the field, and the hose connects it to the hose reel. This is the hose reel, and the thing is turned on, so the tractor's set up in the borehole, and we get pressure up, and the thing starts to irrigate. And we can time how long it takes to travel down the field. So the amount of water we put on is governed by the speed that the sprinkler travels. And we usually set it to around 25 millimeter, which is 2 meters, 2 minutes a meter. We can transverse these rows. These rows are 150 meters long. We can transverse these rows in about 4.5 hours. In that time, we've watered almost an acre. It's just under half a hectare. We can actually water a good hectare, possibly 2.5 to 3 acres in one day with this system. Now, it uses a lot of water, of course. It uses 25 tons an hour. That's 25,000 litres an hour. And over the course of a day, we're using in excess of 250 to 300,000 litres. 250 250 cubic meters, 250 to 300 cubic meters in a day, which is, if you were paying for it on mains, would be, well, that would be about 700, 600 quid. I mean, it's just, you wouldn't do this on mains. You would only do this on borehole water. We have a abstraction license, which is ridiculously cheap for what we get. Once it's running, this is a really efficient system, and we move it along. It gets moved about 25 meters each time. We've got our field set up, so the field is actually planned up to fit the irrigator. So our agroforestry field, which is this one, the rows are 20. Right, the rows are 24 meters apart, and that fits the irrigator exactly. Right, so here we go, trundling down the field. I mean, to me, I've never got over the sense of awe and wonder at this thing, actually, how this works. I mean, it's cost me a huge amount of money, but it was the best money I ever spent. In total, I spent over 10 grand on this whole system, including the borehole and the pump. I mean, that 10 grand, we actually got that back in the first year, just on the potato crop. That's how efficient that was. So it's been a great system. Right, just very briefly, I think Peter's probably covered most of this in his excellent guide, but just to reinforce a few things, the numbers are really important. And these numbers, I'm surprised at how many people don't know about these numbers. They're so easy, they're so simple. I won't go into detail, it can be shared, but you need to understand the numbers around irrigation and what 1 millimeter actually is, what 1 millimeter looks like, and how many of those 1 millimeters you need in order to get enough water for your crops. Have I got 2 minutes left? Soil moisture deficit, I think, Peter, you covered this in your excellent guide as well. So you need to understand a little bit about soil moisture deficit. You also need to understand a little bit about your soil type, and knowing your soil is really important in the sense of irrigation requirements, because some soils will require hugely more water than others. We are on a very free draining soil. We have 40% stone, so obviously there's no water holding capacity at all in that part of our soil, so it drains very quickly, whereas some soils would be much more able to hold water capacity and wouldn't need as much water. I mean, we are in a dry climate with a very dry soil. So we do need quite a bit of water. And it's really important to understand what your soil requirements are. And water losses, a lot of people don't realize just how much water gets lost through transpiration, through drainage, and evaporation through weather. And people often assume it's the sunshine only, but no, the wind will dry land out much quicker than sun ever will. Wind is the biggest driving factor usually in soil moisture loss. And when to apply your water, I mean, the thing that most people do, and I'm still guilty of it, you tend to leave it at almost too late. You always keep putting it off because it's one of those chores you just don't really want to have to get going on. But once you do start, you have to keep going. You can't really stop. So once you've committed to watering, you have to maintain that commitment, really. And how much water? Right, I'm going to leave this because I've run out of time. Okay, thank you.
We've gone from the most experienced person here, I think, to the least experienced person, which is me. I think Iain started growing the year I was born. So yeah, my name's Dan. I run Glebelands Organic Produce, which is a 3-acre market garden in Sale in South Manchester, on the banks of the River Mersey. And I'm just starting my 3rd season of growing now. Most of what we grow are sort of salad-based crops. So we don't tend to do the sort of field scale stuff like Iain does. It's more sort of high value, high turnaround type crops. I'm probably going to talk a little bit more about the practicalities of building a system rather than sort of, crop requirements and soil in the water and all that sort of thing. That's not my area of expertise at the moment. Still very much getting a feel for all that sort of thing. It was interesting hearing what Tolly had to say about all that. Back in 2017, I did a farm start program run by the Kindling Trust in Stockport. And the year after that, I did quite a lot of sort of work experience on farms, but I actually ended up working back at the site in Stockport where they do the farm start program. And I was actually asked to install an irrigation system. Not sure why, because I've never done anything like that before in my life, but thought we'd give it a go. So that's basically, it's a 2-acre site. It's like a training ground. And there was no irrigation there whatsoever. Again, it's small, it's only 2 acres. And it was a very limited sort of irrigation system there before. Pretty much everything was done by hand, which obviously took an awful long time. So I was asked to come in and build this system, basically, which was actually based on the system that I now own at Glebelands in Sale. So that's where I did most of my research into putting this system in. Having never done anything like this before, it sort of made sense to me to basically sort of draw the whole thing up, so I could kind of visualize what it was that was going to get installed. I actually did, what you're looking at the screen at the moment is actually a scale drawing of the site, because it meant I could easily work out, lengths of things like the distribution on the sprinkler heads, how long sort of, because they were using drip line in the field at that time. I'm not sure if they still are. I think they might have stopped that now, but so yeah, it just, because I've never done it before, it just gave me the opportunity to visualize how it was all going to work, and have measurements for everything. So when it came to like ordering parts and working out what I needed, it made that sort of job quite easy. This system, I think it still uses mains water. It's the lands they get off the council, and I believe the council pay for all the water there, so it's not costing them anything. I don't think. Obviously quite a lucky position to be in. As Iain said before, like running irrigation off mains water can get expensive very, very quickly. I did. You can get quite cheap sort of pressure testing gauges. I think I got one from Screwfix or something like that. It was like 15 quid, plugged it in and worked out I should have enough pressure to be able to water at least one block at a time using 3 or 4 sprinkler heads. And I think I did a bit of a test. I think we bought some heads and standpipes and I knocked up one run just to make sure that it would actually work beforehand, which more or less it did. Obviously, being mains water pressure, it does fluctuate a little bit. So some days, if there's a lot of people out and it's the middle of summer and people are all watering their gardens during the day, then sometimes it's not possible to water as much as you'd like, but that's the way it goes. So the core of the system basically runs around this blue pipe that runs around the outside of the site. This is blue MDPE pipe, which basically runs in a circle. The idea being that when you feed water into it, you get an equal amount of pressure at any point around the ring main. Now, obviously, on this one, because it's currently running off mains, you could only really run one set of sprinklers at a time off of it anyway, so probably not as important at this stage. But should they ever get like a borehole or something like that, or some kind of pump system in there, it does mean that you can run a set of sprinklers at either end of the field, and you're going to get an equal amount of pressure in it, as opposed to if you just have a straight line. I believe you get a drop in pressure the further down the line you get. So that's why we have a ring main. I think we'll move on to some photos here. So yeah, installing the ring main. This is 2-inch blue MDPE pipe. I actually hired a digger for a day and dug the trench myself with the digger. It was about 7 hours on a digger. Yeah, quite hard work, quite messy. I'll just flick up to that photo there, me looking a bit possessed after 7 hours of non-stop digging. So yeah, and trying to wrestle that stuff around on your own in the wet is pretty hard work, but it was worth it. Once it was in, it did the job. So around the site, there are various, we call these access points. It's basically a pipe clamp around the ring main, a tap, and then the geeky connector on the top. So it'll be one of those for each block in the field. And then from that, you can basically run hoses out to either what I'd call a distro hose if you were running a drip line with a sort of timer in line. So you can set that to run automatically, solenoid and a timer. That's the solenoid close up, and there's the timer. They run off 9-volt batteries, those. I found in my experience that most timers, you get about a year off of a 9-volt battery, if you buy decent batteries, of course. So yeah, part of that system also ran into tunnels. That was all pretty much all on like drip line. They were using T-tape at the time. I think they might have gone on to the more harder sort of type drip line. Yeah, anyway, so what else? Okay, yeah, move on to the sales site, which is the place I now own. The system that I based the design of the Stockport one off of. So it's a little bit bigger. It's 3 acres, but the system is basically the same as what I've just described, except the only difference is that we have a borehole installed. That's it with the lid off. When the pump broke last year, so I had to get a new pump put in there. So I took a quick snapshot of that. But and that basically feeds into these 2 big green tanks. They hold 10,000 litres each, and takes about 24 hours to fill them up. So I've basically got about 20,000 litres a day to play with. the pump inside of there, there used to be a pump in the shed, but again, that also broke last year. So I've got another one that actually lives inside this tank, which is actually a little bit better. I can do more watering at one time than I could with the old pump. So that's a bit better. Keeps the pressure at about 3.5 to 4 bar, I believe, possibly a little bit more. And I can basically run 12 of these sprinkler heads off of that at any one time. 3 of those sprinklers will do one block of 6 beds. Our bed system is basically the 30-inch beds with the 18-inch pathways, just to give you an idea of scale. And all the beds are 50 foot long. So yeah, can run 12. I know I can run 12 sprinklers at any one time, but I've got everything sort of set up so that it's usually between 6 and 9. So between sort of two and 3 blocks I water at any one time, basically just so that I've got a little bit of extra pressure for, you know, if you've done some planting out and you need to get some extra water in, or, you know, you're experiencing a particularly hot day and you just need to, you know, get a bit of extra on somewhere. There's always a little bit of extra pressure available. And yeah, most of the system stays set up and in the field for the season. I think I am going to start taking these sprinkler runs down and coiling them up, because what I'm finding, as Ian was saying, if you leave stuff out in the field, it gets knackered. And from experience, I am finding that in the last couple of years, when we've just left stuff out in the field, that things are starting to break. So this is the bottom of the hose that feeds up to the sprinkler, and they tend to get bent. And you can see the crease in there. Once that crease is formed, it's very difficult to get it to straighten out. And you sometimes find you put a sprinkler head up and it's got a little kink in the hose, and 2 of them will fire up, and that one with the kink in it, there's no water coming out of it. And obviously it's more time and effort having to go around at the start of every season, you know, fixing broken hoses. So I think in, you know, next winter we're going to look at getting things tidied up a little bit better and get stuff away. So yes, say again.
Couple more minutes.
Couple more minutes, right? Okay. So yeah, just quickly, that's them in action. I've done quite a lot of work tidying up. There used to be a lot of hoses and stuff lying around, and the timers and the sprinklers just used to like lie in the pathways with the little cables hanging out and all that kind of thing. I've basically started doing stuff like this, where the solenoid is basically mounted straight on the top of the tap. I've put these blue hoops in, tied the yellow hose to that, so it's all contained, it's all very visible. There's less chance of stuff getting kicked around. The amount of times last year where I was having to put timers back together, you know, splicing the cables back onto the solenoids because they'd got kicked about. So I've done a whole load of work tidying all that sort of thing up. These are the sprinklers that we use. They're Netafim Mega Nets. They are perhaps not the greatest sprinklers in the world, but what they are is like bird proof. The sprinklers that we've used in the past are a little bit more complicated, and the birds get on them and peck them to bits. And from other people's experience, these are a better option in terms of protecting yourself against birds. We get a lot of ravens around our way, and they are cheeky blighters, and they peck at anything. What else do I need to quickly add? Tunnels. Yeah, we use mostly drip line in the tunnels. I did install some overheads this year, just because I think it's useful to have a little bit of overhead sometimes. We don't use it as a matter of course. We generally tend to use drip line, and that seems to work for us pretty well. And there's a whole greenhouse system in plant raising, which I don't have the knowledge all the time to get into now. And I think that's everything.
I got 3 different systems that I've worked with. The first one will be really brief because it was quite a long time ago. I don't remember a lot about it, but it was interesting. The second one is like the main experience I had with irrigation working at Hankham. So big glass house, big rainwater collection, 2.5 acres of field veg. That was my kind of main growing experience that I've had so far. And now I'm into a sort of smaller setup and working with kids at a school, teenage, adolescent, secondary school. And that's quite a lot of fun, but obviously has thrown extra element of chaos into the equation, which as a grower is the last thing you really need, but hey, why not? I'd like to sort of just say I really agree with Tolly on a couple of points, which one is about propagation and watering by hand. And the mist and leaf systems I've set up 2 up. One was quite successful, the other one I gave up on. I think that, like he said, he's doing his strawberry runners, so it's important for that. But I think if it wasn't for that, he probably wouldn't have that system. And I don't think it's all that useful if you're growing a lot of a variety of things. It's much better to do things individually and really get to see what's going on and learn how to water things well by hand. And also another thing that he mentioned was his sort of spares set up. And like with Hankham, we had a whole irrigation workshop, like basically probably a quarter of our workshop space was dedicated to irrigation spares, irrigation storage, specialist tools for cutting holes in things, gluing things. So once you get into irrigation, bear in mind that some indoor space and a whole heap of spares is no bad thing. But I'd really love to hear more about his theory that letting soils crack is a good idea, because I always try and avoid them cracking. It seems to cause all sorts of trouble. The first place I worked was for a couple who ran a box scheme, and that was like a nice little setup. And then I left there to go and try and set up my own thing after 3 years and failed fantastically at it after a year. Probably could have stuck at it longer, but I just didn't have the money to throw any more money at it. But what we did was we had a reservoir, and we had a glass house, and we had a petrol pump that pumped up from the reservoir to a tank, and then the tank was just above a little Clark pump that had a pressure switch and an expansion vessel, and then that supplied various sprinklers and drippers into the glass house. So the pros of that were that there was plenty of water. It was a reservoir, although it was a bit mucky. There was good priming of the pump because of the tank being above the pump. It was a revelation, this whole pressure switch thing. Like when you turn the tap on, the pump came on. When you turn the tap off, the pump switched off. That is brilliant. Saves electricity and just seems to make a lot of sense. And I think rather more luck than judgment, we got the pressure and the flow about right for what we were doing. I just kind of randomly bought a pump that seems like cheap and it was going to do the job, and it was about right. And then in retrospect, I realized why. So yeah, that was kind of just lucky. On the downside, like I said, a lot of sediment, which built up in the tank and blocked up the filters a lot. We did put a filter in, so that was one blessing, but the filter needed changing pretty much every day, washing out all the crud coming from the reservoir. Also, the tank was plastic, secondhand, and the first winter it cracked with the frost. The water froze in it, and it popped the tank open. So that was a lesson in freeze protection. And as I wasn't there very often because I was having to keep earning money landscape gardening at the time, it was like I'd turn up really early in the morning and then I'd go off to work and then I'd go there in the evening. So I tend to underwater stuff because it was all a bit haphazard. And so there were other issues around underwatering in a glass house. So I'll just start the screen share and where are we? There we go. Let's just go to full screen. So this was that little glass house, and that's Louise. And yeah, that's kind of how we got started. And then moved on to working at Hankham. Hankham was a much bigger glass house. I can't really get the whole thing in one photo, so it's difficult to get an idea, but it's an acre and a half, or a bit over an acre and a half. It's 7,000 square meters. And we had the furthest tank in this picture at the back was installed by some professional guys when Miles first took the tenancy on. And then I built this second one and put in some sand filters. And this is actually quite recently, because I still work there doing maintenance, and I had to replace the bottom skin, the bottom layer of it, because the rust had started getting in. So you can see I've put red oxide on it this time, and hopefully that won't go so quickly. Now at Hankham, it's mainly PVC and galvanized fittings running through the glass house. It's all above the soil, so everything needs to have good frost protection, and needs to be, even though it's in a glass house. I mean, if we were to think back to 2009, I think it was -11 outside, and in the glass house got down to -9. That's perfectly enough to bust most fittings if there's any water in them. So, and we did lose all of the main stopcocks broke, had to be replaced, but we drained down this system, drained out the pump, so we didn't have any problems with that. Most of the irrigation is overhead spray lines, which were put in, again, about a third of the glass house was set up by the same guys who built the tank. And then we had another guy come in and continued that work. And then I took it over once I went full time there. And then we set up drip line. So just to go back to the tank, that further tank is a mains tank, and it's filled up from this sort of ball valve, and it's important to keep that faucet above the level of the water, so it's not submerged under the water in any situation, because the mains water can be drawn back. There's also a stopcock, a check valve, non-reverse valve on the mains, and so that's belt and braces. And then there's another one on the outlet of the mains, so that none of the other water can get back into the mains water tank. So there's kind of like 3 sets of safeguards to stop mains water traveling back to the main system in the event of an outage and reverse pressure. And that's where the water comes out, and it goes through a filter. That green stuff, suction pipe. So that's quite important to use suction pipe if you're putting under any significant negative pressure. There's our disc filter, and that picture's in the guide. That's it before cleaning. They're quite easy to clean out. Just loosen them off, wash them down, tighten them back up, put them back in again. And then it goes through this old pump. Now we've actually got 2 of these pumps, and they run parallel, because when we did have a problem, like Iain was saying, if something goes down and you can't fix it, you're in all sorts of trouble. And with an acre and a half of glass house, that's even more of an issue than on your field, where you at least could pray for some rain, even if you didn't get it. So we now have the new pump and the old pump running parallel. This is actually the new pump, so you can imagine what the old pump looks like. So then it runs, all of the system runs to these standpipes. The problem with these is that they tend to gather rust. So if you don't use one for a bit, all the rust in the inside of that sort of settles down. Then you open it up and you get this brown sludge coming out, and that's not much good for the drippers. So they do need like flushing out every now and again if they've been sat for a while. The system goes something like this, really. Every single stanchion post and on the glass house has one of these, and the gangway runs all the way up the center of the glass house, and this is one side, this is the south side, and then if you were to look behind you, there'd be another set the other side. And so all of these plug into the drip pipes, and they work by being set up like this. Now, I agree that dripper pipes are an absolute fag if you're outdoors. Like trying to use them on field scale veg or anything is quite tricky, and they get in the way. But the way we were using them was setting them up by having these sets that basically you just unroll on the bed, use some forks to peg it out, straighten them all up, and then put the Mypex over the top and plant through the holes. And so this system worked for all of the crops we grew in that glass house, except for direct sown crops and green manures. And it worked really well, and it's still working really well, and it's been going for over 20 years. The downside to the Mypex is you do get the little strings of plastic getting into the soil, but we use a sort of plumber's torch every now and again, go around in the winter and just unroll them in the gangway and seal around the edges to try and keep the lifetime of them. And we haven't chucked any away due to wear and tear. They've only been thrown away because the spacings becomes obsolete, or they've been hit by a flail mower or something like that. So the other way that we use the drippers is on these sort of beans and peas, row crops, if you like, and that's us using the same type of drip line, but it tended to be, excuse me, spacing was a bit far apart, and so we'd have to tug it sort of 15 centimeters and water, and then like tug it back from the other end 15 centimeters and water again to get the spacing right, which is a bit of a faff. So we moved over to using drip tape. That was a bit of a problem because the pressure was too high for it, so it used to pop. So we put in these pressure restrictors, and that solved that problem. So they just take the pressure down under a bar, and then the tape is safe. And then the overheads were on a separate line. There's 50 mil PVC going over the top. We started off with 2 lines, and pretty much the same as what Iain was saying, where there was just too far apart. There was dry patches, so we set it up so there was 1 per bed. These are 6.4 meter bays, and so each bed is like just over 2 meters wide. The actual cropped area is like 1.5 meters, and the gangways are a bit over 0.5 meter. And then there's one of these lines over each bed now, so you can water individual beds. Although obviously it does go over to the other side, but it does mean that you know how much water you're putting on based on your beds, rather than a sort of random 3 beds in a bay and then 2 lines on a bay. They water about 50 litres a minute if you've got all 3 running. To 150 square meter bay, because the beds are all 50 meters, and that's so if you run it for 30 minutes, you get your 10 millimeters of water, which is usually about the minimum you want to put on in one go. But you know, at times we would run them for less. If you just planted something in, you'd have given it a good soak, and then maybe 2 days later you just give it a little top up. 2 days later, another little top up. I might just run them for 10 minutes to do that sort of thing, just to keep the roots happy of the transplants. So then at the end of those, there's these drain valves. Now, the problem with those was that they shut off a bit quick and caused water hammer. So we had to put in an expansion vessel to try and stop that, which is basically when the water hits the end of that. These allow air out, but as soon as water hits them, they shut off. And then you get this like bang, and the whole lot judders, and things fall off, and fittings pop apart, and it can be a bit of a nightmare. So the expansion vessel helped with that. And then we actually took the water, trying to be really efficient, and took it down to a sort of set of drippers along the base to start with, when we were growing companion plants around the edges. But then trying to maintain all that became really difficult. It was a lot of labor, like paying people to weed pretty flowers around the edge of the glass house that weren't ever going to get sold. Wasn't an option, so we ended up putting down ground cover, and then actually running a lot of this excess water back into the gutters, so that it goes back into the tank, just to save a bit more water. So you can see it set up there. Just a couple of pretty pictures of that. And then this is the rainwater collection. So around about 2008, 2009, we installed this. This is all the guttering running off the glass house. This is looking west and then looking east from the same spot. And you can see all the gutterings coming down to this bottom pipe that gradually gets bigger and then goes out. You can see the gate at the end there goes down to the field. Almost the tank. There's me looking like I'm sort of hovering mid-tank somehow. And we got a contractor in to dig a hole in the ground so that it was down at the right level, so we didn't have to build the tank much further down the field. We wanted it a bit closer, mainly just so that it was kind of easy to get to and not so far to pump. And the landlord was quite happy to have it sort of tucked in this little space under the trees and not lose too much grazing, because this is a shady spot. Downside to that is a lot of tree leaves fall in it, so every 2 years we'd empty out the tank and then clean up all the leaves and all the mush that built up in it. And then we put in a center pole and this kind of circus big top sort of thing with the ropes, and have a cover on it, so the cover keeps out any debris, stops birds going in there. And that kept the leaves off for a bit, but then we had problems with snow. So we only had a decent snowfall. It not only damaged the cover, but it pulled the sides of the tank in if the tank wasn't full. The simple solution was to basically keep the tank full. And so that was a lesson learned. And this was the cover being changed. So this I had to put a new liner in. And so the last liner lasted about 10 years, so from like 2009, 2008 to 2018 or so, and changed that over to a new one, which was kind of pricey, but it's paid itself off. We've harvested, I think it's now 40,000 cubic meters of water, I think we've had through that. I wrote that down somewhere so that I could tell you, and then I lost a little bit of paper. There's a water meter down there, and we can read off the picture of the water meter somewhere. And that's where the rainwater harvester comes in. There's a little sump to catch any glass that comes off the roof, and then the stuff's sort of got a foot. There's a foot valve, gets pumped back up from the submersible pump, and then up into the rainwater tank, where it has a float switch. And if that's hanging down and the tank's empty, then it pumps. And if that then fills up, that switch, the blue bit at the bottom lifts up, and the yellow bit at the top is the weight, and that holds it down. And that means it inverts, which then switches the switch and switches the pump off. So that's all automated and works really nicely. So the first filter we put in, because the water out the reservoir is pretty good, you know, it's rainwater, but it's not perfect. There's moss on the roof, things can get in the tank, and little critters kind of breed in there, little bloodworms and pond skaters, and you know, you find all sorts of life in there, which is great, but it's not great for. Okay. So we converted that up to a larger system so that it runs through the 3 other sand filters parallel, and then through the red one, and then the red one has charcoal in it as well, to mixed with the sand. It doesn't work well with charcoal on its own, but mixed with the sand works quite well. On the field, we use some drippers occasionally, but that's very rare. So mostly it's the sprinkler units. So we started off with these little micro sprinklers, but there are a lot of work setting them all up. And so we moved on to this larger unit, which is a Nelson R2000 wind beater or wind fighter or something like that. Anyway, it works well because it's quite an exposed field. It's quite windy, so it needs something that can cut through that wind. And you can set them up with the road deflector or the 180 degree, so it only waters from the sprinkler half of a circle. And they've got these nice quick fit connectors, so you just roll out the LDP pipe and go along, clip them in. It's about 5 down 50-meter row, and then watering in young leeks. They're a nice little unit. This is a system. I just put a random photo in. This isn't my farm. This is Metzger. who works at Bore Place, and he's been using this system for ages, is solid set and riser. So they're, it's a brilliant system. So I wanted to pop that in there. They're metal pipes, and you just connect them all up. They just clip in and you drop it down, and works brilliantly. And then just to where I am now, this is how we started. Talking about mishaps, this is like the sort of first start using a hose lock reel off a really rubbish main supply, rolling out biodegradable sheet mulch and then putting enough compost on it to hold the sheet mulch down, probably about 2 or 3 centimeters of compost, planting through that, and then like using this thing to spray it with water, and a real faff. But it's it got us started off. We wanted to just get going with some crops straight away. The other areas were cultivated, sown to green manures, and then sheet mulch to kill off the green manures, and then start planting from there. So once we actually got to a slightly larger size, we could justify putting an irrigation system. And this was just at the time of lockdown. So I managed to actually get all of the equipment in over the winter and the spring. And then we hit 2020 lockdown, and the school bubbled up. So it's a residential school, so everybody stayed there. So we had like 4 or 5 weeks where we didn't come, we didn't go. We just, if anyone left, they couldn't come back in. We set up this system. We got them digging the trench. We found an underground tank. We cleaned it all out, and that has been set up now. So there's the foot valve in there running through, goes underground and into this horizontal pump through a filter, and then off to sprinklers. That's a little Hadar little micro sprinkler. And then we also use these impact sprinklers. I mean, they're pretty good because you just set those 2 little metal clips, these clips here, and you can get any degree of an angle from 360 to about 15 degrees. And so that's really useful for watering from corners of smaller plots. And then we set up manifolds for drip tape as well in the tunnels. And this is just to kind of set up for those sprinklers. Just if I've got a moment just to go through the sort of pros and cons of this system. We had a blank canvas, which is always nice to start with. Like, there's nothing that you've got to kind of key into apart from a mains tap, and it was kind of fun doing it with the kids. It was quite easy. I had the experience at that point to actually be confident that I could buy everything and get people involved, and that we wouldn't end up running out of parts or do the wrong thing. The pressure switch technology, it's not a fancy thing, but it's absolutely brilliant. You can put timers on, and they just come on and the whole thing runs. And we've got clay soil there, so most of the equipment is quite low application rate, which works well with clay soil because it's got a very slow absorbency. And the whole kit for the school cost under £2,000 to set up, with the pump and all the sprinklers and drip line and everything. It needed to be really simple for the kids to use, so that's, in one way, it's a bit of a downside, but it's really taught me a lot about choosing things which are robust and straightforward to use, connectors, the way the taps work, the sort of pressure that works well. We run it about 2.5 bar, which is about as low as you can go before it becomes a bit pointless. So if you go much higher, and the kids switch the tap on because they think it's funny to try and soak each other as they walk past the taps, at least it doesn't completely blast them to kingdom come and knock them off their feet. And also because I'm there as like a standard 9 to 5 day job, that it's it's kind of something that's easy to set up for work, in not having to live on site and getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to set up field sprinklers and stuff.
Charles is asking, really important to get a feel as to how, really interested to get a feel as to how important a ring main is. We're just about to install the main through the site. A ring main would be quite tricky, but not impossible. We've only got 3 bar. Does anyone want to answer that for Chaz?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I'm aware, I mean, it kind of works like electricity in your house. It's like if you have a ring main, you essentially get, you know, the water, you get an even pressure around your whole site, so you can water from different points on the ring main and get the same amount of pressure. Whereas if you have just a straight line from A to B, the further down you go, the more you tap off of that line, the less the pressure is further down the line. So as far as I'm aware, I would say a ring main's probably quite important.
Yeah, he talks about only having 3 bar. Well, 3 bar is okay, but I mean, the important thing is to make sure you have the right size pipe. If your pressure is a bit low, you cannot have a pipe big enough. So the bigger the pipe, the better your pressure will be, because you'll lose a lot of pressure on small pipes. So 3 bar is fine, but you need to pipe work to go there. And if you've got a ring main, as Dan says, it's going to give you much more equal pressure.
Okay, thank you. A question from Adam, which I asked, I think. Why are the water reservoirs inside the glass houses?
Because when we took on the glass house, or when Miles first rented it, there wasn't anywhere outside. He literally had a glass house and then a barn and a turning circle for a car. There wasn't anywhere. We don't own the land. It's rented, and that's where the landlord wanted it put. Plus, when he took it on, it was probably double the size of the glass house he was really looking for. And I remember when I first went there, he was like, I don't know what I'm going to do with this great big thing. And I was like, oh, I do. So, yeah, it went inside. It obviously means that the water, it warms up the water quite nicely. Like Tolly was saying, keeping, shock of cold water is not great. And it meant that the plumbing was quite simple. It's a bit more frost protection. But really the actual reason was that the glass house was massive, and we just thought, yeah, let's stick it in there in the corner.
Andy's asked about water filtration. We are adding a bit in the irrigation guide about that, Andy, and Pete did touch on it. So I will leave you to look at the guide. It's going to be re-uploaded, so there'll be a section on filtration. Jimmy is asking, have any of you used bottom watering for propagation? Do you have any strong opinions?
Yeah, we used to use bottom water for propagation and found it was not ideal. We get a lot of problems with algae growing, and we didn't really feel it was a very efficient system. Some parts of the trays were staying dry, so we prefer to overhead.
Never used it, never tried it, so no opinion.
Yeah, I have touched on it at times and found that quite good if you got big pots and you go on holiday. You can put stuff in a tray, and then it's sort of, you can fill it up with water, and then if you ask somebody to water it and they under or over water it, it kind of doesn't matter too much. But for module trays, I think really it's not that it doesn't work, it's just that in a conventional system you'd have capillary matting and you'd have hormone treatments to stop roots growing into the capillary matting, and it would all be sort of set up as a system that's not really not at all suited to organic growing. What I've always found is that plant roots do like to grow downwards, and so if it's moist underneath the tray, they'll grow into the moisture and you get a mat of roots. And then you're getting a lot of root disturbance when you pull things out of the module trays. And it's better actually to try and keep the roots in the module tray, and if you can, almost like air prune. So once everything's been established, once those roots start trying to get out the tray, if you can get them on a bench, if you're not at a really sort of cold time of year, you can get them on a bench where the base is open. It's actually better for them to be air pruned, especially module plants.
May Chan's asked rainwater collection. She is asking a question about an overseas field project. What are people's thoughts on using river water? Is it something you would say needs filtering? Does it contain nutrients? Could it cause plant disease? Are there any materials such as stones, gravel, compost to filter through?
Yeah, I think the first point about any water source is, if you're not sure, you need to have it analysed. And I think river water often in this country, particularly dodgy, you need to have it analysed. So I think the starting point there would be to get a really good water analysis. And then if it's filtration, Peter's the expert on filtration. You can filter water, Peter. You're the king of filter water.
Filtration, well, there's if you're talking about like just a passive filtration system where you pour water in the top and it goes through gravel, then sand, and then silt or something, I mean, that's perfectly possible. But then you've got the issue of what happens when it's all clogged up, and would you chuck it all away and start again? And how quickly does it clog up, and does it flow through quick enough? So the sand filters which we used, they're sort of under pressure, and you back flush them once. You'd have a pressure gauge either side of the side that the water's coming in, and then it goes through all the filtration, and its side it's going out. You have a pressure gauge either side that you can compare. And the sand filter will come with a pressure difference, and it'll say once the pressure difference is like 0.6 of a bar, then you back flush, and so then that will clean it all out and start all over again. And I think they're brilliant units. They're not specifically designed to get rid of heavy metals and bacteria, but they do actually in practice get rid of quite a lot, because the sand doesn't just act as a physical filter, it acts as like a static filter as well. So the way that the sand particles work, if the water's moving through them reasonably slowly, is they attract particles to them as well as physically filter out particles. And so you do actually get smaller particles taken out of the water than perhaps the size of the gaps between the sand particles might suggest. And and so they work brilliant. And then if you want to be sure, like Iain says, you can do analysis of your water. If you've got a closed system like we have at Hankham, where the water comes off the roof into a tank, the tank's got a lid on it, comes up to another tank, the tank's got a lid and it goes to a pump. We've always found the sand filtration seemed to work pretty well. I only analysed for heavy metals, and more out of interest than necessity. And bacteria, I was never sure quite where to go for that. And actually, having looked online recently, there seems to be quite a lot of available services for getting your water analysed. So just look online if you want to analyse it, and then you're looking at for watering salad leaves and making sure that stuff's clean. UV will get rid of bacteria. Reverse osmosis will get rid of just about anything in the water at all.
Anyone got any recommendations for timers that could be set for pulse watering on a regular basis throughout a day in a tunnel to prevent soil drying out?
The ones we use are the Irritrol Junior DC, the battery-powered ones I was on about before. And they seem to work just fine for us with those solenoids. I don't know about pulse watering. I mean, you could set them up to... got a pretty extensive sort of set of programs you can get them to go, whatever period you want, however long you want, 5 from 1 minute to like 10 hours or whatever, forever, it's like 3 times a day, 1, 2 or 3 times a day. So, and I think off the top of my head, I think a timer and a solenoid combination, when I bought them, which was, the last time I bought any was last year, and I think it was about 70 quid for a set. And they were, I haven't really used any others apart from those ones, and they work fine for us. So, yeah.
Iain, did you want to share the last few slides in your presentation?
It's pretty much self-explanatory, I think. I think I've written it in a way which is pretty clear. The numbers, as I said earlier, numbers are really important, but they're so simple and they're so easy. I just can't imagine why we didn't learn this at school. In fact, I wonder what I did learn at school, because I didn't actually learn anything at all useful, which is why I left at 15 and said goodbye to education, because I didn't learn anything at school at all. So something like this is so easy to remember. 1 millimetre of water is 1 litre per square metre, and 1 litre happens to be 1 kilogram as well. Whoever dreamt up this metric system was an absolute star. They really were. They did such a good job. Compared with our, antiquated systems of measuring that we've had in this country up until recently, of which I still use all of them actually. It's not exactly rocket science. So if you are adding, the average that we will generally irrigate to is around 25 millimetre. Which is, 250 tonnes per hectare. That's 250 cubic meters. And if you want to imaginary cubic meter, it's 1 IBC. So 1 IBC will give you 1 millimeter over 1,000 square meters. It's not very much, you know. So when you start thinking about storing water, you need to really be thinking, as Peter has with his greenhouses, quite large scale. So soil moisture deficit, this is a really important thing to understand. It's not very easy to just stick your finger in the soil and try and get a sense of this until you've had a lot of experience. And even with experience, you can get it wrong. And then one of the things I've noticed is, particularly so in tunnels and greenhouses, often if you dig down a couple of foot, you'd be horrified at how dry it might be, because often the water's not getting down. So in many cases, people tend to be watering just the sort of the top few inches, which looks as if they've got rid of their soil moisture deficit. But the soil moisture deficit goes beyond the top few inches. It goes way down into the subsoil as well. So if you've got inherently dry subsoil, you will never manage to get enough water onto your plants. And then one of the things we noticed with drip irrigation was that we were getting this kind of very strange effect on tomatoes where they were just keeping within the water zone, and our soil tends to not spread the water very well. It tends to just run down. So tomatoes' roots were quite narrow and they were forming like a channel, and they were following the line of the water, which is why we've gone back to mostly overhead irrigation, because they just weren't doing well enough with trickle irrigation. So soil moisture deficit is really something you need to be, you know, really thinking about and aware of. And then different soil types. There is the ideal soil and there's the less than ideal soil. Most of us tend to be, we've been pushed to the margins of soil in this country, and all the smaller scale and organic growers tend to be on pretty low grade land in most cases. Our soil is grade 3B. We are a stony, low holding capacity soil. We do have about 18% clay, which helps. If we were stony and very sandy, it would be even more desperate than it already is. Soils high in organic matter have a really much higher holding capacity, but it's not enough to talk about increasing your organic matter just so you don't have to water. You still need to water. There's a lot of myths going around about watering, and one of the ones I get to hear quite a lot is, oh yes, well, we're growing drought resistant varieties. There is no such thing as a drought resistant variety. It will tolerate drought, but it just won't perform. It won't give you a crop. So whatever you hear about a drought resistant plant, it just means it will survive during drought. It doesn't mean to say it will actually give you a crop. So you're still going to have to water, and low organic matter in soil is definitely a big disadvantage. So if you're on a really low organic matter, sandy soil, you are going to have to put a lot more water on. So, you know, understanding your soil, as is so important with all aspects of horticulture, understanding your soil is really essential when it comes to watering capacity. And then I've already talked about this one. So when to apply water, yeah, this is, like I say, something you tend to put off, and I'm still guilty of this. I tend to leave it until it really needs it, because at the back of your mind you think, well, it's going to rain any day. No, it doesn't. It never rains when you want it to. You know, it doesn't matter how much you dance, it will not rain when you want it to. And if it did rain, then it's great. And there's nothing quite like irrigating in the rain. People think I'm mad to be out irrigating in the rain, but it means you don't have to put much on. It means that the water's soaking in really beautifully. So actual irrigation during rainfall is a really good time to do it. We rarely get enough. I mean, most of the rainfall we get here in the summer is 2 or 3 millimeters. It's gone by lunchtime. In fact, it's gone by mid-morning usually. And the majority of people will always overestimate how much rain. We have little guessing games on the farm every morning, like how much rain did we get last night? And nearly everybody reckons it's twice what it was. So we check the rain gauge. Oh, only 2 millimeters. I thought we had 10, because it sounds like a lot. It looks like a lot, but actually it's very little. So applying water is really down to all these factors: the temperature, the soil type, your growth stage. I mean, we don't put anything like as much water on carrots or parsnips, say, as we would potatoes. Last year, we probably put more water on than we have for probably several decades. And on potatoes, we applied in total to the whole crop 120 millimeter, which is, for us, it's quite a lot. Conventional growers are working on usually on averages of 250 to 300 millimeter. So we're only using a third of what a conventional grower would use. And I think that's partly because we have better soil holding capacity in the soil because it's better organic matter and because we're not trashing the soil. So the growth stage is important. We only water when plants get decent size. We may put small amounts on at small seedling stage and gradually increase the amount as the plant gets bigger. Potatoes are the most demanding. They will get through, literally will get through 40 millimeters a week. That's the deficit. So how much water really does depend, again, on so many factors. This is a hypothetical situation, really, but 1 hectare field of sandy soil, average soil moisture deficit, that's the amount of water you would need to bring it up to capacity, could be anything around 50 millimeters a month between May and August. Last year it got higher than that, quite a lot higher than that. And if you're growing field veg, you're going to need a fair bit of water. So over that period of time, you're looking at 200 millimeters. We've never actually applied that amount because there's nearly always, within 4 months, there's always some rain. Not usually enough, but there's always some. And finally, just a few samples. I mean, potato really at the top of the list there in terms of amount. And we are watering partly for yield. We do get staggeringly good yields considering the poor quality of our land. We're in excess of over 40 tonnes a hectare, and that is definitely down to irrigation. We wouldn't get anything like it without irrigation, but we also get really decent quality as well. Things like root crops are on a third of what we would put on potatoes, so we just don't do it so often. We would go around all the crops generally every 10 to 14 days. We may miss the root crops out, maybe an extra around, maybe another 10 days beyond that. Things like lettuce, if you don't water them often, you just don't get the quality. You get really rubbish quality. And of course, the heavier the soil, the less water you're going to need. And to answer your question, Pete, about why we let our soils crack during drought, this is only happening on our long-term fertility building, which is 2 parts of our 7-year rotation. The reason for that really is I like to imitate what nature does. Nature would not have watered that soil. And what I've seen is quite incredible. It's quite remarkable what happens. A lot of the green manures do die off. Last year, we have a mixed species of plants. We have about 30 species in that green manure mix, and most of them actually died off by early August. The only things that survived were the chicory, the lucerne, and 1 or 2 wildflowers. The ground cracked. I mean, we had cracks 1/2 inch wide and probably 12 inches deep, and that's really good. So when it does rain, the water runs straight back into the soil. It doesn't run off the top, it's straight in. So that natural cracking, that natural fissuring allows the water to infiltrate into the soil. And within 2 days of rain, which was towards the end of August, all the seed bank that come from the flowers which we'd allowed to seed there, the green manures that had been allowed to seed, it just burst into life. So we got an amazing cover, came back literally in 2 days. So nature, nature's a great healer. It's really good at sorting these things out. And that green manure now is looking fantastic. It's looking really good. So that drying out, I think, is really important because it is what would happen naturally in nature.